It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our global event to celebrate International Women's Day 2022. My name is Georgia Dawson and I am the Senior Partner of Freshfields. We have had a terrific uptake for our event today. Over 800 people have registered, which I think makes clear both people's passion for the topic today, but also the interest of our audience in the experience and insights of our two speakers. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the events in Ukraine, which, aligned to our title for the event today, highlights the importance and impact of allyship, inclusion, and taking care of each other in times of crisis. All of us have watched the unfolding humanitarian crisis with distress. We have been shocked by the invasion and disregard for international law. However, we have not stood on the sidelines. We have all looked after our colleagues and their safety and well-being. We have coordinated large-scale pro bono and humanitarian relief efforts, and we've gone beyond black letter compliance in our approach to clients and mandates. I know that many in our audience are doing the same things as members of the global business community, each trying to play our part to bring this war to an end. We have already led the collaboration of pro bono efforts across various firms and organizations, and would be delighted to collaborate with any of you if there is interest. And if there is, please do get in touch with me after today's event. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Break the Bias, encouraging all of us to challenge gender stereotypes, promote allyship, and celebrate the achievements of all those who identify as women. Like others, we as a firm celebrate International Women's Day each year in March, but the work doesn't stop outside the month of March. We're committed to creating an environment where everyone feels they belong and can excel each and every day. This time last year, in March 2021, we set global targets for diversity and inclusion, including new, refreshed targets focusing on gender representation. So between now and 2026, all new partners at the firm will be at least 40% women, and there will be at least 40% women in all key global leadership functions. Our targets build on our focus on diversity for many years, and we're proud to have made progress in the last year, and we've been recognized for doing so. For example, we achieved gold standard certification with Women in Law Empowerment Forum, and we were awarded Mansfield Certified Plus certification in the United States in 2021. Having these targets ensures that we continue every day to drive for further progress. And our commitments, the actions that we're taking to achieve those targets, recognize the roles that every single one of us as colleagues have to play in this. We know that having successful and targeted programs can also make a real difference, and we're currently running the 6th cohort of our global sponsorship program, which aims to support women in the development of their career and to retain high performers, many of whom will progress to senior roles within the firm. Over 150 women have taken part so far. Our global women's networks across the firm also play an active role in our drive towards gender equity at all levels of the organization and creating a culture of inclusion for all. They provide us with a platform for colleagues to discuss issues and share insights that then help to inform our strategy. With their collaboration, and a huge thanks to our HR team, I'm also proud that we continue to build our inclusive benefits around the firm, including inclusive fertility and family forming benefits that cover all paths to parenthood. A big thank you to my colleagues who have helped to organise today's International Women's Day event. I do not underestimate the significant time and effort involved. Now, as an Australian, I am delighted to have the opportunity to welcome my country's former Prime Minister to the firm. Julia, thank you very much for making time for us today. And Matt, as a valued client that is always looking for ways to innovate and improve, I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you both for joining us today for this incredibly important event. James, over to you.
Georgia, thank you very much indeed. And as you say, a huge thank you to Julia and Matt for joining us. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And actually in recent years, we've held these events with Freshfields. I'd like to think that it's a measure of the lead that Freshfields has chosen to take on this issue of diversity and inclusion in an industry that knows it's got work to do, that actually we do get so many people coming and being part of this conversation. And frankly, without sort of sparing your blushes, Julia and Matt, it's a measure of the fact that people take it seriously, that you're here too. So a huge thank you for all of us, and we're really pleased to listen to you. I wanted to start by just picking up on the points that Georgia made in her introduction. It's impossible to talk about allyship today without looking at what's happening in Ukraine and trying to work out what, as good allies, is the right thing to do. Julia, do you want to just share a thought on how you see things developing now, and I suppose what you think should happen?
Yeah, James, I wish that I had some incredibly novel analysis or new answer to such a tragic set of circumstances. The truth is, I don't. I've been watching the suffering of the people of the Ukraine and their fighting spirit with compassion and also admiration for the way that they are standing up. Obviously, for nations around the world, the force of the sanctions and how we can keep increasing that force really matters. And getting nations globally, everyone, to lean into that. So the diplomacy that's required to ensure that as many actors as possible come together to exercise maximum pressure on President Putin and his regime to end this war. And then the humanitarian work is so important too. We've obviously seen the horror of humanitarian routes being established and then people being bombed and shelled as they try and get access to them and literally run for their lives. This will be a big call for the international community, the aid and development community, the humanitarian community to help people through.
Mm-hmm. Julia, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in one moment. I know that Matt is also kind of thinking, how does an organisation, a tech platform like yours, Matt, try to provide support? Do you want to let us know a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I echo Julia's comments. Just was speaking to a colleague this morning who managed to get her family out of Ukraine, and know how many stories like that there are. And talking to our team in Poland this morning, with over 1 million refugees arriving in Poland, it's visible everywhere, and there's a lot for us to do. I think from a company perspective, I guess for us, you know, we're in the information business and people do turn to Google when they need help. And so getting accurate information to people in Ukraine through maps, like where are the border crossings, where are the bomb shelters, taking down fakery, really important. If you want to find out what's going on, you need to make sure you've got accurate information. And then also looking at our responsibilities in line with global sanctions. So removing, you know, Russian channels from YouTube across countries, these kinds of things, really important. I suppose the other thing that occurs to me, James, is, you know, we were just seeing the clouds of the pandemic being driven away by the spring sunshine in Europe, and suddenly we've got this sort of darkness across us. It's going to be very hard in the medium term as well. I think the economic and social impacts of all of this. So all of that's on our minds. And I suppose one thread from all of that to this discussion, I think one of the things we saw in the pandemic was governments, companies, and communities working closely together at pace to address a major crisis. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we can see the same kind of collaboration, you know, in response to the invasion and the war and the after effects. We also need it in other areas like climate change. So I think it's increasingly clear that collaboration across those different boundaries, if you like, is vital to our future.
Matt, thank you. And I just wanted to pick up on a point, you know, a word you used there, Matt, which is discussion. One of the things that's been great in past conversations convened by Freshfields has been to say, look, we really want to hear from everyone in the course of this hour. So please don't be coy. If you want to weigh in, respond to something that Julia or Matt has said, share an experience in terms of how you're approaching allyship, how you feel as though either there is a bias or you can break the bias, please make sure you do that. So just, you know, raise a digital hand or message me or one of my colleagues in the chat, and we'll make sure we bring you in. But Julia, let's come to the focus of today's conversation, because I suppose that there's a way in which you go from what we've just talked about and say, look, actually, if anything, it puts a greater expectation on us to deliver on that progress, to, as Georgia said, you know, take care of each other. And I wondered whether, we'll come to your time as Prime Minister and politics in a moment, if you might, but I just wanted to sort of tap in on the intelligence you've got as the chair of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at King's. And it's always hard to know whether or not we're making any progress or whether we're stuck. What's your read on what's the state of play?
Well, James, thanks for that question. And I do want to acknowledge Georgia and Freshfields, because Freshfields has been a wonderful friend to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. We've got a research collaboration we've been working on, and I want to thank them for that. Each International Women's Day, we do a major polling exercise with Ipsos Mori. So everybody, I think, would know the global polling firm Ipsos Mori. And we take a deep dive into various gender attitudes around the world. This is a 30-country survey involving around 20,000 people. So it's quite a lot of people. And, you know, I guess if I was going to summarise, and I'm looking down to make sure that I get the figures right, if I was going to summarise for you, James, I'd say we're making progress in terms of the number of people who believe that gender equality should exist and that it doesn't exist now and that we have to act on it. But there are still stubborn minority views, hearts and minds we need to change to make this a community-wide project. So to give you a flavour of that, 21% of men agree that gender inequality doesn't really exist. They don't think gender equality. They don't think gender inequality exists. Around a third of men think feminism does more harm than good, and around the same percentage think that traditional masculinity is under threat. So giving you a sense that there's a stubbornness to some of these attitudes. We also delved into the online environment. Around half of the people surveyed, men and women, said that they'd experienced or seen online abuse or sexist content. And the vast majority, almost 80%, agree that women should not have to put up with that. But interestingly, agreement with that is a bit lower among men, and even more intriguingly, a bit lower among younger generations. So some things to delve into there. And then we've got, you know, a small percentage, around 15%, but still a concerning percentage, who say that they believe that women who say that they have been abused or raped are likely to exaggerate or make these claims up. And it's men that disproportionately hold that view. So it's 15% overall, but we're talking about 20% of men and 10% of women. So still some progress, even on the most basic things in gender equality, like women's ability to navigate the world without sexual violence, and if confronted with sexual violence, to be believed.
So I hope Julia will come to a range of those different issues. And if you're watching, my colleague Laura's kindly shared the link so you can read that data in more detail. I wonder whether we can start with one of the questions about gender pay gaps, representation in senior firms. You know, it would be stunning, even as little as I think 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, to hear the head of a Magic Circle law firm say, you know, we want to have 40% representation in senior positions, right? I suppose the question for everyone, whether they're working in a firm like Freshfields or they're working in different kinds of companies, is how do you do that well? Who needs to engage to make sure that happens well? And I wonder, Julia, whether or not you've got some advice or guidance on making that happen well.
I think for that to happen well, it has to be men and women, and it has to be at every level of the business, and it's got to be driven by the evidence. I mean, I think we're in this sort of sticky bit now. You know, major firms, law firms, businesses around the world many of them have been the task of gender equality for some time now. And so they've done the obvious things. You know, if I look back on my own lifetime, you know, a long time ago, I emerged from law school and was seeking my first job in a law firm. And it was very common back then for a law graduate to be confronted by an interviewing panel that was 3, 4, 5 male partners of the firm. Now, no one would do that now. So what we're trying to get to now is the more stubborn, deeper seated barriers, partly structural around work and family life questions, partly unconscious bias, stereotypes that come into play and hold people back, hold women back. And to really identify those barriers, you need a whole firm effort, men and women, and you certainly need leadership from the top. Otherwise, people won't take it seriously. And you need to break down the data. Where are the women? Why are you losing them? What do exit interviews tell you about why you're losing them? How are promotion rounds being done? Are you really looking at merit, or are some stereotypes being brought to bear, or some metrics being used which are inherently discriminatory? So all of those things have to be dug into. And as we, you know, perhaps not in every firm every time, but many businesses will now embrace virtual work as an ongoing component of what they do. How do we make sure that this virtual environment is one that actually assists with gender equality? We're worried that at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, if we don't get this right, in 5 or 10 years' time, we'll wake up in a work environment where women are disproportionately choosing to stay home because it helps with family life matters. Men go to the office and men are much more visible come promotion time. So we've got to be really thoughtful here.
So Julie, will you just expand on that? Because I think that's one of the unexpected lessons of the pandemic, is that what looks like it might work in the short term, ends up having really adverse consequences over, as you say, 3 to 5 years. So what do you do as a company, as a colleague, to make sure that it works?
I think you've got to plan now for navigating that environment. So to just give a simple example, I mean, we are familiar with what the old presenteeism used to be like, you know, the young man who might be able to be in the office from 7:30 in the morning and is still there at 9 o'clock at night. And come promotion time, everybody says, gee, you know, he's a really hard worker. He's always here. He's always around when I need him. Not realising that using that metric of long hours of presenteeism at the office can be an inherent bias against women, particularly in the family formation stage, where disproportionately the statistics tell us women still do the caring labour, so they're more likely to do the childcare pickup, the after school pickup, to rush off from the office if a child is sick and all the rest of it. So if you get a different metric, not hours presented at work, but quality of outcome, that's much more likely to be fair between the genders. And we've got to think about that now as working patterns diversify from in-office attendance.
And I'm going to come to Matt in a moment, Matt, but the question I'm going to ask Matt is sort of, how does a man work in the office to change the environment and culture of the business and industry they're in? But I'm going to ask you to help him out, Julia. So what is the answer to that question?
Well, a few things. One, leading by example. The evidence certainly shows that if both men and women use family-friendly flexibilities at work, no one's career suffers. If only the women use the family-friendly flexibilities, then they get on the mummy track and they're not seen as the ones who should be promoted, so their careers suffer. So actually, you know, if you've got family responsibilities, and almost everybody does in one shape or form, whether it's children or aged parents or relatives in the family who need assistance, actually making use of the leave, the flexibility, showing people that you're doing it, that makes a difference. Then second, speaking up. This is a bit of a galling finding, but the evidence does show that if a man speaks up about sexism, he will be taken more seriously than a woman speaking up about it. The woman is seen potentially to have mixed motivations. It's in her interest to raise the issue, whereas a man who raises it is just seen as raising it because he genuinely believes it's wrong. Then, diversifying your working practices in line with the best evidence and research. So how you run meetings, how you invite people into the conversation, how you structure things like the, working hours, promotion metrics, hiring metrics. All of these things do make a real difference.
Okay, Julia, I'm going to turn to Matt, and I should just say before we go any further is I'm acutely aware that the pitfalls of these conversations, Matt, are that it's very different depending what industry you're in, what even part of a company you're in. So please, if anyone's joining us and thinking, look, you're not really speaking to the kind of work or the kind of working environment that I'm dealing with, don't feel you need to be polite when in the chat, and I'll bring you in. But Matt, how do you answer the question of creating a company that does break the bias, that does enable allyship, and how do you do that as a man?
Yeah, well, and thank you kindly to Julia for giving me some of the hints. And I got to say, one of the key things I think as a leader is just trying to make sure you're immersed in the data and the stories and what works. Things like the Institute for Women's Leadership, really important. Things like, McKinsey's work on understanding the fact that, while we are seeing growing representation of women in senior roles, there's a sort of skew away from line roles into sort of servicing and support roles. There's a whole array of stuff there that I think it's important to be in. I mean, I guess I feel like I'm here, like as a leader of a tech company, we've got an important role to play, as Julia alluded to, in making the online environment one that's positive for everyone. That's part of our mission actually at Google, building products that work for everyone. And I always say we can't do that unless we are everyone, right? We need engineers that represent everybody. And at the moment, technology is, skewed against women, 70% male. I'm here as a business leader. And so to your question, how do you, as a leader, create an environment to that? I think the world of work has been built by men, and it's been made by men to be sexist, intentionally or otherwise. And therefore, it needs men to dismantle that with women, but it needs men in leadership roles to dismantle it. And then I'm here as an enthusiastic amateur, right? A man who's trying to figure out how to be a better human and citizen. And I think one of the key things there is like being prepared to put yourself out there and get things a bit wrong. That's probably one of the biggest small lessons that I've learned is when people give me feedback, hey, it was really helpful when you talked about your childcare responsibilities in front of everybody that day, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But also when I've made a mistake and I've phrased something in an inappropriate or non-inclusive way and stepping back from it. I think going to sort of the corporate question, which you asked about, delighted to hear George's stance on what Freshfields is doing with targets and holding themselves accountable. At Google, probably 10 years ago or so, we published our diversity stats, which were woeful. As I say, engineering is a big deficit, and that's half of our company. So we're over a third female, but not on the engineering and product design side. And that's one of the biggest areas of focus for us. So making it transparent and admitting you've got a problem, always the first thing, and then putting in place processes, systems, etc. Whether it's the old sort of unconscious bias training, which leads you to go, hang on a minute. When I look at our job descriptions and our appraisal grids, they're all written actually with biased language. How do we take it out of that? And then the other thing I feel that's really important is I worry about, and some of the literature suggests this as well, sort of designating, champions of change, male champions, etc., versus making it everybody's job. The culture of an organization is everybody's job. We launched a program driven by bottom-up insights, actually, from frontline people, which is called It's Up to Me. And it basically says, what are you doing in your quarterly targets? What's the one thing you're doing to make the culture better? Making it feel like everybody has a role to play in that. So I think there's a logical side, that more equal organizations perform better. Your products need to be built for everyone, so built by everyone and so on. But then there's also the kind of behavioral side. And lots of this, I think, is some of the examples Julie gave, some of the systemic things, but also some of the role modeling things, indicating that you're welcoming to everybody. Looking out for different styles of engagement. For example, we found in promotions on the engineering side, we used to self-nominate to promote, and the self-nomination rate for promotion was much lower amongst our female engineers. So actually, we changed the system to one in which we supported everybody coming through a much more open process rather than waiting people to feel that they were ready to be promoted.
Matt.
And then finally, for me, I'd say learning from others is always, always, always helpful. So this kind of forum really useful. Learning from businesses in different sectors really, really useful. We've got just as much to learn from 100-year-old law firms as we had from 2-year-old tech startups, probably rather more.
Matt, can I ask you? I see Victoria Sigeti's got her hand up. So Victoria, I'm going to come to you in one moment. But I just want to ask you. You know, Julia's stats point you to quite a stubborn population of people who think things that you would have thought, no, in 2022, I'm amazed you think that, right? Within companies, large ones and even very modern ones, there are these clusters that often remain stubbornly, overwhelmingly male, right? And obviously I talk about that, and I think the interesting read across from kind of law firms, professional services businesses into tech is everyone inside those businesses, if you like, knows where they are. When you've looked at it within Google, have you thought, look, there are some places where there are cultures or reasons of history that things are extremely unrepresentative, but overall the company is on the right track? Or do you think at quite a granular level, you've got to go in and, this is kind of clumsy language, but kind of break up those groups?
Well, I think there's two things you touched on there, James. One is representation and the other is culture. So I think you can have groups where there's kind of reasonable representation, but the culture's not where it needs to be, as well as groups where there are low representation, but maybe the culture's more healthy. So I think trying to understand that is important. So yeah, we definitely, you know, provide people with representation data. Gender's straightforward. Actually, when you look at other areas of underrepresented groups, some of those things are harder from a legal and data standpoint. And, you know, particularly conscious of intersectionality and how much further disadvantaged intersectional groups, you know, women of color particularly are versus women. We have decent data, as you'd imagine, right? It's an engineering company, so I always say, you know, in God we trust, everyone else must bring data. And actually convincing people to change does help when you have the data. So we have a very thorough employee survey, the results of which landed in my inbox last night. And what you can see in that, and one of the things that's really driven change for us, is when you see that some groups rate their experience of working in our company less highly than the majority. And that helps you to sort of look into, well, why, on what dimension? So for men, women, actually, there are many places where it's pretty much aligned, but you can see parts of the organization where it's not. And you can see particular parameters where it's not. Maybe, you know, fairness of promotion process would be one sort of historic example for us. I think the data has helped us. I think the other thing is, you know, none of us know how to do this actually. So, you know, what Julia has to say is really helpful, going to authoritative sources and say, well, you know, there seems to be something that's working there. Maybe we should do that too. We've got a particular challenge in our sort of industries, like we want to be innovators. So we kind of think we have to invent everything. But you know what, there are people out there who can do some of these things really well, and helping to our managers and leaders with things that just work, I think is really, really one of the critical ways to drive change. And I think finally also, you know, I think mostly people understand this can't change overnight. Because we're talking about deep-rooted human behaviors, some of the ways which we're hardwired, you know, in terms of our humanity. And so trying to make sure that we're able to make progress and demonstrate where we're making progress, and that is visible, and that the environment is getting better. So I go back to my point about representation versus culture. I want to improve representation, but I also want a world where people tell me their experience of working in the organization is as good regardless of, you know, their background.
Yeah. Matt, thank you. I said I'd come to Victoria, and just to give people fair warning, I'm going to try if I can to come to Kate Cooper, not least because she's asked the question I most wanted to ask. But Victoria, I'm going to come to you first.
Thank you, James. I just wanted to kind of pick up on one of the points that Matt was just making, which is one about culture, and speaking kind of very personally about my career and in a sense the impact on my career of allyship. You know, the biggest part of it for me personally was helping me to feel like I belonged at Freshfields. And, you know, and until I found my allies, I didn't think that people like me became partners at a firm like Freshfields, or in fact in any big law firm. And I think I would have self-selected out. And in a sense, for me, it wasn't necessarily just about gender. It was about belonging in a much broader sense. So whether that was about, my background, even my accent, the way I choose to live my life, the way I want to parent my children, all of those things. In a sense, I was making assumptions about the organisation and my place in it, and actually finding allies. A huge part of that actually was just about somebody helping me to believe that the organisation would recognise my talents. And there's a huge element, I think, of sponsorship in that. There's a huge element of people advocating for you. That there is no doubt a big investment of time, actually, that allies make, in a sense, in the people that they are allies to, and finding out what people find challenging and how you can help to support them with that. And sometimes sometimes I needed my allies to tell me to pull myself together and face the gremlin on my own shoulder. I mean, that's kind of part of it too, I suppose, from my perspective.
I just think we should sort of stop here and just listen to this. I would love to hear all about those things, those conversations, not least, I think, because I saw Julia nodding and a fair few other people nodding as you were speaking. Victoria, I think all of us, or many of us probably, will have worked in organizations where our first weeks, months, years were just spent thinking, I don't really belong here. And is someone going to tap me on the shoulder shortly and tell me? And so feeling that sense of made to belong makes it just such a difference. Julia, I saw you were nodding, but before you respond to what Victoria said, I just want to bring in Kate Cooper, because I've been holding back getting into the experience of being a woman in Australian politics. And for anyone who's spent any time on the internet, there's an exchange that is quite famous, probably one of the best political exchanges in quite some time. And Kate, you wanted to ask about it. So Kate, I'll hand to you.
I did, and I know it's a very selfish thing to do, Julia, but I couldn't resist, because what a privilege it is to have you talking to us. And I actually think so that, that exchange between you and Tony Abbott, when you basically just took him down, was just fantastic. And I've actually watched it so many times when I've had a really bad day. But your point about, actually it's often when men take sexism to task that it's listened to, and that we as women sometimes, aren't listened to, is really interesting. And I sort of wondered how you had got to a place where you felt that you were able to say what you said, and how do we actually do, maybe not quite in such extreme way that you did, but how do we manage to call out the behavior that I do see around me? And there are times, I'll be honest, where I've kind of gone, I'm not going to say anything. How do you do that without seeming like you're whinging, or that you have some kind of ulterior motive?
I think that's a really great question, and actually one that's very, very hard to answer. I mean, I think, firstly, in terms of what's come to be known as the misogyny speech, I mean, it obviously is a speech in a particular context, and that is in Australian Parliament House, parliamentary chambers. People conduct themselves in a way that if you started to do in the office or on the bus, probably something very bad would happen. Someone would be calling the police or something. Mostly people don't end up in those kind of strident arguments in everyday life. But I do think that we've got to give women encouragement to call it when they see it. And I think one of the reasons that the speech still resonates is it resonates with women who, for whatever reason in that moment at that time, have thought that they couldn't raise an issue when it's happened to them, and the speech has helped them work through that frustration. So I think we've got to normalise these conversations, and possibly to normalise them, we've got to find ways through them that allow the issue to be raised and discussed without it turning into, a confrontation, with it having a sort of positive ending. A friend of mine who's a good friend of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, she's a senior civil servant. She's a woman of colour. She's, a small person. And even though she's a very senior civil servant, she can give you chapter and verse about how many times when she's turned up at a meeting, people have looked at her and just assumed that she is one of the sort of hospitality staff, serving staff. They've asked her where they should put their coat or where they should get the coffee from, because they've assumed that's her job. And she says she always says to them, look, you've assumed that I'm one of the hospitality staff, but actually and she describes who she is. And then they are sort of mortified they've made that mistake. And she says, well, look, I just wanted to point that out, but now that I have, let's start again. And, she reintroduces herself and lets them reintroduce themselves and start the conversation. So she's made the point without it then meaning it's impossible for her and that person to deal with each other. And I think that's really very smart behaviour, to find the way of making the point but continuing the conversation.
I don't know whether you wanted to follow up.
I totally agree. I think it's exactly that. That's the issue, right? That you want to call out the behaviour in a way that's positive and sort of promotes change, but without making it into such a cringe sort of moment that you can no longer interact with that person anymore. I mean, so the most recent one that I've got so many, but the most recent one I've had is there is a client that just uses my name and the other female partner on the transaction just interchangeably, because they're just like Freshfields woman. And I don't really quite know how to say, it's just maybe not quite right.
I know how those things can feel from my legal career. I can remember some of those moments way back when. I mean, often humour is a good way through these things. So if you and the other woman, have some joke about your names or how different your names are, or something like that kind of makes the point. I mean, I don't want to. It's not our job as women to make sure men feel comfortable. That's not our job. And so there are going to be moments where people are uncomfortable, and they can be learning moments. And so we shouldn't shy away from that every time. But in the real world, where you've got relationships, you want to maintain relationships, and you still want to make the point, often we do have to find the strategy that gets us through with the point made without maximising the discomfort.
Julie, can I just follow up asking just two questions on this, right? One is that, I think people appreciate, don't try this at home or on the bus, approach the Tony Abbott speech. But I think there'll also be lots of people who work in firms, in large companies, that have been trying to make changes on this front for a long, long time, who are deeply frustrated and feel as though they're caught between what you describe, which is doing it with a certain kind of courtesy and humour, and then effectively feeling kind of acknowledged, but not much more than that. Or the alternative, which is actually really standing your ground and then risking being seen as a problem. And I suppose there's a real question for everyone on this call, which is for those people who are feeling that they're going to need to fight to change this, how do those around them work to help them so that there's not a stigma around them? What's the role of everyone else in that?
Well, I think firstly, it's the obligation of the people with the most power to stand the ground. So if you're in an organisation where, the case for change has been put and it's been acknowledged with a sort of, their kind of pat on the head, then, if people who want change, in particular women who want change, come together, then the more powerful people in that group are the ones who are best positioned to stand the ground, and they should. There is always comfort in numbers, in collectivity, and in bringing a group together and doing it together, rather than just putting it all on the shoulders of one individual to bear the brunt and potentially bear the backlash. And, Matt might well have observations on this, but in today's talent market, I think, it would be a pretty foolish employer that risk time after time disgruntling staff whose skills and capabilities that employer needed, particularly if they're standing their ground together, because in this kind of labour market, people have got options, and if they don't feel like they're getting listened to, treated with dignity and respect, then people will use those options.
And Julie, I'll come to Matt in a moment. Can I just ask you one other thing? You said at the very top, when we were talking about the numbers from the Global Institute, you talked about attitudes to violence towards women. And often in the workplace, there's a discussion about violence towards women and a focus on opportunity, promotion, representation. What's the relationship, though, between the two? How can you be an ally in making changes in the workplace and also feel as though there's something that you can actually do about this much bigger and in some ways much more disturbing, or much more as disturbing, a set of problems around violence against women?
I think these things are all related in the sense that they're about power and the exercise of it and who has it, and whether or not people who have power act with responsibility alongside that power. So the more that we can shape our world so that at work, at home, walking the streets, but when intersecting with the police, women are seen as genuine equals. What they've got to say should be valued. If they make a complaint, then it should be acted upon, and acted upon seriously. The more that we can model and shape and put into practice those values, the better it is for women everywhere. So, if a workplace takes seriously sexual harassment, then that in and of itself is modelling a culture that values women and their rights and their right to their own bodily integrity and not being preyed upon, which can then speak into the wider world.
So there's a sort of institutional leadership point that if you see organisations modelling a behaviour, it changes. Julia, I'm aware of time. I can see, sort of, as is always the case, kind of more hands start coming up in the last sort of quarter of an hour. I'm gonna come, if I might, to Salua. And Salua, I think that you're in the Netherlands. You're in Amsterdam. Yeah, far away. I think you're muted. So let's just make sure we can hear from you. Yes, it's a dramatic pause. There you are, far away.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Hi, yes, I'm in Amsterdam, James.
And I saw you put a thumbs up just to the point that Julia was making, and I just wondered what your response was.
Yeah, I was actually going to maybe add a bit of a different comment to the very valuable insights. Thank you so much for that. And I was thinking about, what Victoria said about believing in yourself and having allies that actually make you believe in yourself. And for me, I think within the firm, as much allies as you can find, I also had a lot of benefit from allies during my career path outside of the firm. And those can actually also be clients. And I know there's a mix of clients here as well. And so I just wanted to mention one example where a senior female counsel at a very important tech client of the firm actually took the effort after a pretty hard deal to write a long email about, what she valued about the team and calling out how happy she was. And in a way, it was a very small gesture, but it has a very positive impact. I really felt, she at that point in time was my ally. And I think we can all contribute in being an ally, not just within our own organization, but also, when interacting with others. I think we can all make that positive contribution. And I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Thank you, Sula. Julie, I will come back to you, but I just want to hear from Matt, because we've made a couple of points there, and one of them is about how teams respond to pressure for change. What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the discussion on allyship Sula was just talking about is really important, isn't it? What's the norm in your team when there's some sort of behavior like that? And one of the things I found useful is there's a fantastic Kurt Vonnegut quote, which is, one day you wake up and realize that the little things in life were actually the big things in life, which has been sitting with me through the pandemic when we thought about, family and baking and all the small things we've taken for granted. But actually, there's something about how small things add up to behavior and culture in organizations. So, what's the norm in the room when somebody says something which other people are uncomfortable with? Does somebody lean in and call it out or not? And there's a nice term, which is, picking up litter and planting flowers. So when the small things are addressed, actually, it becomes an easier environment for the big things to be addressed. So picking up a behavior and saying, hang on a minute, you did interrupt, let me just hear from that person. Let's all hear from that person. That's an obvious one, isn't it? But you're all the kind of misnaming people or whatever. Taking action on those, picking up the litter can help, but also planting flowers. I've been surprised by how often I've had little feedback from people. I was chairing a meeting and I had, somebody said to me, you asked us to come in and present and you made me come and sit and present sitting right next to you. And that made me feel like you had my back. And I didn't even notice that I was doing that. But once you hear that, you go, okay, I get it. And I think the other thing I just wanted to pick up is such a rich conversation, and I'm jotting notes like everyone else. There's this sort of notion of a network of allies and supporters that I think is really powerful. There's a book by Dr. Zella King, which is called Personal Boardroom. It's this notion of like, who's in your boat, who's around your boardroom table, the people who've got your back maybe, but who will also tell you when you're being a bit of an idiot. We all need that sort of network of people. And what I notice is in business, sometimes it's easier to group up with people like you rather than group up with a more diverse bunch to try to do that. So, example for me, I'd cycle to the office in the old days when we had offices and commuting, and I'd shower and I'd meet a bunch of people in the changing room every day. And they were from all different backgrounds, and it was great across the organization. Of course, they were all male. And I realized that there's just a range of places where I was just more going to be running into people like that and needed to be more aware of building a network of women that felt I was accessible and that I could hear from and could tell me I was an idiot or could share things from different parts of the organization. So I had to get over the discomfort. We have a cafe, seeking out tables where women were more represented rather than men. Getting over that, well, does this feel a bit odd and creepy? I'm going to sit down with a load of women in their 20s. Actually, no, it's part of my responsibility to do that because I want to hear from them. And I think there's so much in that sort of trying to create those team norms and being aware. Final thing, I remember doing a International Women's Day panel a couple of years ago where I was the facilitator of the panel, and it was all female panel, all CEOs. And just as we were miking up, they were observing how often they go to meetings and their male colleague is assumed to be the CEO. Just like you mentioned the example, Julia, of your diminutive colleague. And I'm aware of that, but I'm not aware of how frequently that happens. And so there are lots of things that as a man, I think you're sort of aware of, but you're not aware of how they land with people or maybe how often they're happening. And I do think that's really sort of helpful to have that network of people who, as a male leader, you're hearing some of the stuff that's going on or being reminded of some of the experiences that you don't have.
Matt, can I just ask you, we talk a lot when we have these conversations about things that are cultural and behavioral. And I think a lot of people would like to see more things happen that are structural and systemic. So I wondered what you read across from the debate about climate. You talked about that right at the beginning, the kind of allyship or alliances between individuals, companies, governments. what do you see, for example, around supply chains and diversity and inclusion? Do you see a world in which Google says, okay, we're going to work with you, but only if your company behaves to these standards? And likewise, internally, how do you deal with reward around these behaviors so that your sorry to use the jargon, but your KPIs are linked to these kinds of behaviors? What do you do that's structural and systemic?
It's a really good question. I think, this point about governments, companies and communities, really important in this issue as well. So I was on the board of Sainsbury's for 9 years, and during that time, the UK government required the gender pay reporting. And you look at it and you go, well, this is kind of the wrong metric. You have to explain to people representation feeds into the kind of thing, and it's a bit complicated, but actually it's really good because it made every board focus on what the hell are our numbers and why aren't they better. And so I think really crude sort of intervention like that has actually, we'll see whether it's really driven the change we want, but at least it kind of makes people sit up and pay attention to something and get into it and have to stand up and explain why and what you're doing about it. On the supply chain side, I think also really powerful. In climate, we're talking about scope 3 emissions. How do we reduce emissions in the supply chain? A Google good example on this topic, though, would be marketing. We work with lots of companies to help sort of market and explain our products, as many do. And our chief marketing officer, Lorraine Toohill, set out a standard around, the representation of the teams that we were hiring to do this work for us. But then actually, they realized that the content of some of our video advertising was not doing a good enough job in representing the world. And there's this horrible stat that a few years ago, something like only 3% of creative directors in the advertising industry were women. I think it's now into the teens, but it's still absolutely shocking when you see that and you see that most purchasing decisions are made by women. It's bad business, let alone a bad approach to work. So what we do now is our teams work really hard around the content of the work. And there's a big piece of work in advertising called unstereotyping that tries to kind of make sure that the images we're portraying are not stereotyped images all the time. The mother's coming in doing the cooking, the kids are getting their shoes on going to school. This is not the kind of world we want to be portraying. So I think some of those things can help by having clear standards about that and communicating them.
Matt, thank you. Julia, I don't know whether you've got, I'm going to come to Jonathan Char in a moment if I can, Jonathan, but I just wanted, Julia, to your point, because I think there is a moment here, isn't there, where there's a risk that, if you like, big companies that are either listed or very prominent behave in certain ways, but then you'll see a stubborn body of businesses that don't really change because they're not in the public eye in the same way. So do you think that there's a political intervention that needs to happen that moves things further and faster?
Yeah, I certainly think things like gender pay gap reporting, where businesses can be held up to account, really matter. And even for those businesses who think that they can somehow sink, beneath the radar and just keep doing what they're doing because they're not particularly consumer facing, those regulatory interventions will still hold them up to the light. And the more unacceptable this behaviour gets generally, the more those real recalcitrants will stand out. So that's really important. Even in businesses that aren't particularly consumer facing, there's also now the transparency that comes with employee reporting. So all of the things that people do on, websites to report experiences with employers and whether employers are good, on gender equality or on anti-racism work or whatever people's personal experience is. I think in this talent market, more and more people will be looking to those sources of information to work out who they want to work for. And then the business to business stuff that Matt talks about, who major businesses will and won't deal with, is also going to be a driver of new behaviours, even if individual businesses themselves aren't particularly motivated. The commercial pressure will make a difference.
Julia,
James, can I just pick up on something from Julia there for a second? Because I just want to acknowledge, we're in this unique moment. Okay, maybe half of most countries' working population have to work in a physical location, but we're in this unique moment of developing the future of work, many of us. What are we going to do to carry forward some of the freedoms and advantages that we've learned about during the pandemic, and also kind of put that back together with some of the advantages and opportunities of being physically together. I think it's a huge opportunity, but a massive responsibility. If you look at participation rates of women economically during the pandemic, they have fallen dramatically. People have dropped out of the labour market, people have reduced their hours. And if we don't get it right, I think the new hybrid world of work will be complicated and more challenging for typically people with primary childcare responsibilities, often women. But if we get it right, we can actually make it a more inclusive, more flexible world of work. So, and none of us know how to do it. So it's a great example of where we need to be transparent and sharing and learning as we go. We need to look to what the real experience of people in our teams and different parts of organizations are. But I just want to mark that sort of importance of this moment that Julia sort of started to allude to, that, you know, huge opportunity, but responsibility and quite significant risk based on what we've seen.
Matt, thank you. Really, yeah, that's some really substantial. The 2020s are turning out to be a very, very busy decade. I'm going to just bring Jonathan Cha in, if I might. Jonathan, yeah, do weigh in.
Thanks, James. I mean, the conversation this evening has been fascinating, and I think what's really interesting is we've sort of jumped between, you know, structural solutions and, you know, very big picture, you know, points that we're looking to address this issue, and we've also heard from some really personal experiences as well. And I think that last point that Matt made around, you know, the digital world and the new ways of working is particularly interesting, because, you know, when we talk about, you know, typical ways to build culture, you know, can we be as empathetic in a digital world as we think we might be able to in the real world? I kind of wanted to make one point, which was, when we look at, there are big things that I suppose, you know, male allies, and we talk about allyship, we can, you know, we can think about and we can obviously support. But there are also lots of little things as well, and I think we've got to be conscious of, you know, the structural things, but also in our everyday lives, build this into our psyche. And I'll give you a small example, which I think Matt also touched upon as well during his some of the points he was making. And when I was talking to one of my my female colleagues recently about sort of allyship, you know, the biggest example that she gave and the key thing that she remembered was, you know, this example where we had a big meeting and all the women were seated on one side of the boardroom table and all the men were seated on the other side of the boardroom table. And it really took, you know, a small gesture of, you know, one of the male colleagues to say, well, you know, the table isn't sort of very balanced. And, you know, for all of the sponsorship programs and the systemic things that we put in place, you know, this example was something that stood out in her mind as an example of, you know, the firm trying to build a better culture. So I think whilst we also, you know, we need to try to make these big statements, and I think you know, governments and organizations are making big progress on that front. I think it's a collective responsibility for allies as well to make sure that we, you know, build these small things into our day-to-day lives, because increasing the conversation is I think the way to make incremental progress. So
thank you. No, it's not, also because it's something that we can actually do. I'm going to try and make sure that we end up on time. So I want to just say a big and heartfelt thank you to Julia Gillard. A big thank you to Matt Brittin. Matt said something, two things that really going to sit with me. One is apologize for your mistake. So I'm going to start early and say, look, I'm sorry, because there are a number of people, I can see Holly and other people who wanted to weigh in. That amongst many other mistakes, my apologies. But also this sense that I think from Julia and Matt that we got of actually what we can all do. Actually, it's felt like at a time where you can feel quite despairing, you actually have a sense of actually your agency in things has been incredibly encouraging. And with that, I'm going to just hand back to Georgia, because I don't know whether, Georgia, you've got observations or comments on the conversation we've had.
Thanks, James. Many, and I won't keep people with all of them. Really just 2 points. Somebody in the chat commented on the role of clients, and this is something that I have banged on about for years. I think clients have an incredibly important role to play in discussing this issue with your external advisors and using your voice in a really effective way. I think it does change the discussion within law firms and within other people in the supply chain. So we try to do it in our supply chain And we've done a review of our supply chain and our procurement processes to use our purchasing power effectively, and I'd be encouraging clients to do the same. The second is the point that Julia made right at the beginning around changing the ecosystem. And to be slightly pejorative, for many years, the programs that we've had around in all organizations have focused on fixing the women. And I know that's not quite what it is, but it's focused on fixing the women. And what I think we now have to do and are doing is focusing on fixing the working environment and the ecosystem that we all work in. And a key part of that, as Julia said, is looking at and valuing properly outputs over the inputs. So just those couple of quick observations, but it's been a great discussion. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Georgia, for making it happen. Thanks, everyone.